everyone, I'm Dr. Yoki.
And I'm Dr. Lu.
Welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to be talking about why we chose psychiatry. And there are a lot of different reasons why we chose psychiatry and why we love the field, but we're just going to be talking about the top few reasons why we specifically chose psychiatry.
So with all that being said, let's get started. So one of the biggest advantages to being a psychiatrist is that there's just so much flexibility in the field. Going from fellowship options, for example, you can get a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry, you can do a fellowship in consultation liaison psychiatry, and you can even do a fellowship in geriatrics. The other thing that you can do as a psychiatrist is you can vary what roles you take on. So you can be either an ED psychiatrist, you can be an attending on the inpatient wards, and attending is usually the supervising psychiatrist that's on the wards, or you can be a psychiatrist that has a private practice and does most of their work through that venue. In the ED, you're one of the first few psychiatrists to see a patient when they have an acute mental decompensation. In the inpatient wards, you tend to see patients who are severely ill and require more of a chronic, or rather more of a long-term treatment in order for them to recover and be able to go back home. In private practice, it's really what you choose to make of it. You can do a private practice in many different areas of psychiatry. And given that the overhead in psychiatry is relatively low, it's, compared to other specialties, quite a bit easier to start up your own private practice if you choose to go down that route. The other aspect of psychiatry that's also great is the research. So if you choose to do so, many psychiatrists have a tendency to do some research on the side or to do full-time research, which is something that I'm particularly interested in doing.
And I know that doing private practice isn't unique to psychiatry. Like, you can do that in medicine, surgery, and a lot of different fields, but it's very difficult to set up a private practice because of the overhead costs. You have to pay for a nurse, you have to pay for, front staff. There's a lot of equipment involved, and so it's very expensive to set up a private practice if you're in medicine, for example. But within psychiatry, it's very easy because you don't really need all that extra, equipment. It's psychiatry. You don't need necessarily a nurse in your office. You just need someone, who can schedule patients' appointments. So the overhead costs are very low, and so that's why in psychiatry, you can do private practice at any point in your career, and it's fairly easy.
Well, another reason why we ended up choosing psychiatry is just simply it's an overall fascinating field. There's so much you can do, and given the population that you're working with, there's so much help that they need. You really get a sense of fulfillment when you're able to work with this patient population. And not only are the diagnoses themselves quite interesting, as is the patient population, the research itself is also quite fascinating. There's individuals who are thinking of using artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to be able to further understand how the brain works. What is it like for your brain to have depression or schizophrenia or to have bipolar disorder? There's new psychopharmacology that's being investigated, so new drugs could potentially be on the way, and it's an area of urgent need in the field of psychiatry.
So I personally really love psychiatry because even within the same diagnosis, if patients come in and let's say 5 patients come in with depression, they all have a different story, they all have different symptoms, and you might actually treat them all differently based on their symptoms, based on their history, and based on everything else that they tell you. With every specific patient, they have a story that will drive you to really hone in on a specific treatment that's right for them. And it might not be the same treatment that you give to the next patient that you see in the same day. So I love that about psychiatry. You really have to think hard about every single patient and really get to know them well in order to find the right treatment for them. Another thing that's really interesting about psychiatry is there's such a strong connection to ethical issues and legal issues within psychiatry. And there's actually a specific subspecialty within psychiatry called forensic psychiatry, in which those specialists really work with patients that have severe mental illness, but also whether they have the insight to really understand what they're doing and what crime they're committing if they're, say, actively manic or actively psychotic. That I find that really fascinating, is that interplay between the legal system, some ethical issues, and then psychiatry, which is really unique to the field. So another thing that I really love about psychiatry, which connects to what I was saying earlier, is you have to get to know your patients really well. And what I love about psychiatry is that even though this seems like something minor, like, oh, that's not that big of a deal, but like usually intake appointments are at least an hour long. So you have an hour to talk to the patient to really do a full psychiatric evaluation. And I'm not sure of any other medical field which gives you that much time to have an appointment with someone for the first time, a whole hour to just talk to them and get to know them. That is really hard to find. Now, this differs with practice to practice and, potentially area to area. Not every psychiatrist is going to spend 1 hour on the first initial evaluation, but for the most part, that is the standard. So I absolutely love that I have the opportunity to talk to my patients, really get to know them, and ask about things that usually patients don't get asked about often in medical visits, like their deep social history, like where were you born, where did you grow up, like how is your relationship with your family, like who can you turn to, and all of these really deep questions, getting to know the patient thoroughly and really in detail, I find really valuable about psychiatry. And I love that. I love just getting to know my patients really well so that I can understand what things drive them or what things might impact their presentation and their mental illness.
And to that point, I mean, even if you're not the type of person who is extremely excited about talking to a patient for 45 minutes to an hour, there are some psychiatrists that primarily focus on something called medication management. So they'll just make sure to review the medications that a patient is currently receiving for their psychiatric illness. They'll have maybe some therapy involved as well, and that's up to them. And then that's how they typically structure their practice. It really is a matter of what you prefer. Some people choose to do both medication management and therapy, others to lean more towards one or the other. So one of the other unique advantages about psychiatry is that the culture itself lends itself to having a better work-life balance. So in comparison to other specialties, what we end up seeing is psychiatrists on average tend to work fewer hours than those in other specialties. Around, give or take, those in psychiatry tend to work closer to 40 to 50 hours per week versus other specialties that are pushing closer to 60, 70, even 80 hours a week in some surgical specialties. Now, of course, that's not to say that that's the only reason you should be picking psychiatry just because of the work hours, because just because it's fewer hours, in some ways it can be a bit more draining. You have patients who have undergone severe trauma in their life, and that trauma has led or has contributed to the development of mental illness. And seeing several patients in a day with unique and sometimes harrowing stories of whether it's trauma or whether it's emotional abuse or whatever the case may be, sometimes that can really have an effect on the providers. So that's partly why it's important to take into consideration that even though psychiatry has fewer work hours, the demand of the job itself can play quite a big role in terms of your overall satisfaction with your career. Now, of course, with every specialty that you choose to decide to go into, one question that's always in the back of everyone's minds is, how am I going to do financially? And just because you're thinking about finances with regards to picking a specialty doesn't make you necessarily a bad person. We all have loans. We all have typically 6 figures in loans. I mean, Carla and I can definitely attest to the fact that she and I both owe well over $100,000 in loans. So it's important to take that into consideration when you're making a choice on what specialty you want to go into. So with all of that being said, relative to other specialties, psychiatry does make less, of course, but you're still making over $100,000. The average psychiatrist in the United States was said to have made somewhere between $200,000 to $250,000 per year. Now, keeping in mind that not all psychiatrists necessarily work in the same sector. Some may work in the public sector where they're less likely to make a larger salary, whereas those who are in private practice or who work more hours are likely to make more. But those who work more obviously end up earning more as well. So it's really a matter of what you make of it. But just because you see average numbers less than other specialties does not necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to pay loans, or you're not going to be able to be comfortable financially. There's many other aspects involved in that.
It also depends, just to put this out there, on like where you practice, like how many other psychiatrists are there in the area. Is it very competitive? So there are other things that factor into how much money a psychiatrist makes, but that's just usually the average.
But for us, it allowed us to be able to both have a strong connection with our patients and also gave us the option to be able to be financially comfortable at the same time.
overall advice for those that are still debating on what specialty to pick, someone told this to me when I was in medical school, and I really appreciated that advice, so I'm gonna pass this along to you guys. So one person told me, okay, pick, like write down the top few specialties that you like, and write down what are the most common things that they deal with on a day-to-day basis, like 80 to 90% of the time. What do they see? So for example, in pediatrics, most of the time, outpatient pediatrics, they do wellness exams, right? Wellness pediatric exams. Or in psychiatry, like the most common thing that you see if you're an outpatient psychiatrist is, depression and anxiety is very common. And so if you pick one of the things that they most likely do on a day-to-day basis, and you can imagine yourself doing that every single day for 30 years, like straight, would you be happy? Would you look forward to going into work every single day? And for me, psychiatry was that specialty that really I thought would make me feel really happy on a day-to-day basis, because in every field there are certainly interesting cases that really kind of make an impression on you, like would be, for example, a person who presents with psychosis, but it's actually, NMDA receptor encephalitis. Like, that's super interesting. If you're the first person to see that patient and you diagnose it, like, that's really cool, but you don't often see that. I mean, you can see that often, but not every day. I mean, it's not something you're gonna be dealing with day in and day out. So if you can see yourself doing that every single day for 30 plus years for the rest of your life, and you are happy and you look forward to...
Hi.
Leo!
What you doing, Papa?
Leo, get out.
Definitely agree with you on all of those points. I mean, I was in a very similar situation when I was deciding on whether to go into psychiatry. What really cinched it for me was I had an attending who basically told me, okay, put yourself in a situation where you've just gotten off of a 24-hour shift on any of these specialties. It was a very busy shift. It was one where you were seeing patient after patient after patient. And then you get home and your program director tells you, you need to read an article in this specialty or don't come into work tomorrow. If you had to choose, which specialty do you think you would be still interested, even after a rough 24-hour shift, to read and still be fascinated by it? And the specialty that you choose in that situation, that's the one that you should apply to. Mm-hmm. And for me, I very easily picked psychiatry. Like, I knew, the research itself is fascinating, the patients themselves are fascinating, whether it's a case report or whether it's a new psychopharmacologic intervention that's being thought of. I'd rather read about that than anything in the other specialties that I was considering.
So that's it for our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you really enjoyed our video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so that you don't miss out on any content that we put out.
And if you have any questions on how we ended up choosing psychiatry or any questions from your end, let us know in the comment section below and we'll help you out with that.
All right, see you next time.
Take care, everybody.